But that being said, so in this last lesson for us today, this is, I think, where we cover the most difficult to grasp aspects about ASM. All the rest of it from this point, I think, make a lot more sense once you understand this. And what we're talking about here is learning, staging, and enforcement, because it has a lot to do with the behavior of ASM when it comes to blocking requests. And if you don't understand that, then you're unclear on why ASM is or is not blocking something that you thought maybe it should or maybe it shouldn't. We're going to start with what are called entities. So there are 4 different entity types in ASM. Anyone have a guess at what one of them might be? A file type. That's what you guys did yesterday, getting this list of file types. The other ones, URLs. Then we have our parameters. And then finally the cookies, much like the list I put up over here yesterday. So every security policy we create can have a whitelist of all of the allowed entities for that security policy. I can. I don't have to. So yesterday you built a whitelist of all the file types, but you didn't have whitelists for parameters or URLs. It's totally acceptable. The more whitelists you have, the more positive security you have, and the more inherently secure your policy is going to be. So we're going to move the policy from the front door alarm closer over here to the more sophisticated security system. But keep in mind, let's say I've got file types, a file type whitelist. One of the things I mentioned yesterday, one of the benefits, one of the reasons why I think all policies should have a whitelist for file types is because it's quick and easy to create. There's not that many file types that are needed for a policy, for an application. And most importantly, the list of file types doesn't change very often. So there's not a lot of ongoing maintenance for that whitelist. Whereas, let's say I want to have a URL whitelist. So I want to specify all the valid URLs for this policy. Adds a lot more security. But now I have to make sure that when I'm building the policy, every URL is accessed by someone so that it becomes part of my policy. But more importantly, as a web application is going through changes, the developers are adding new URLs and they're removing URLs. So this whitelist is going to have to continue to evolve and change. So there's a little bit more work involved, but it's more security. So always remember, more security usually means more work. So a quick reminder of parameters. To understand what a parameter is how we interact with web pages inside of forms. So everything in there, from the name fields to the drop-down lists to the radio buttons and the button we click on, those are all parameters, and they all have a name in the back-end web code. So if you right-clicked on any one of those and chose inspect, it would show you what the name was. The developer of the web page created all those names, so we don't know what those names are. Sometimes you also, I guess I'm jumping ahead there. There we go, inspect. So there's the name of that parameter. That one makes a lot of sense. That's good. You also may see parameters, parameter names, and parameter values submitted by the user. You may see it up in the URL. So, for example, I'm going to look at the movie times in my zip code of 98119. So the initial request page ends where there's the question mark up there, right before the word mode. That question mark identifies that we're now about to see some parameters and values. So my 2 parameter names are mode and queue. And then the 2 values are general and 98119. So when I'm building my policy, and I see that ASM has learned about a parameter called Q, am I going to know what that is? I'm going to have no idea what that is. I'm not going to know if that's valid or not. So that can be a challenge especially when you're dealing with parameters. So in order to have a fully complete security policy, there are 3 steps. We haven't gone through all the 3 steps yet so far yesterday. The first step is learning. You did a little bit of that yesterday. Then the second step is staging. And then the final step is enforcement. If we never make it to this step, then we're going to find that a lot of malicious requests are still going to be accepted by ASM, even if we're in blocking mode. And we might be confused as to why. I thought I built the policy properly. So we're going to make sure we go through these one at a time. This is really the focus of this whole lesson: learning, staging, and enforcement. So first off, let's review what learning is, because you actually did this yesterday. What is learning? So learning applies to entities like file types. So you had ASM learn all of the file types for your security policy yesterday. And then in your third exercise, you had it do it automatically. So what you should have seen is you automatically ended up with this list and your file type list, just from a couple of requests from trusted sources. So this is my whitelist, my file type whitelist that ASM learned about. Then we also can learn about URLs. So this is my URL whitelist. And we can also learn about parameters. There's my parameter whitelist. So learning is what you guys did yesterday when you built your policy, and then you went to the learning and blocking settings page and you said file types, learn always. URLs, learn always. And parameters, learn always. You said, I want to learn the comprehensive list of entries for each one of those entity types. That's what learning is all about. So those are all different entities in this security policy. So how to configure this, I already talked about it, but go to our learning blocking settings page, we come down to our 3 sections, for example, file types, and we set that to learn. URLs, set that to learn. And then optionally parameters, set that to learn. You don't have to do all 3 of them. Remember, you can pick and choose how much positive security you want. It's up to the customer and how much security they need for their web application. But I will tell you this, by having a comprehensive file type list, URL list, and parameter list, it's going to be a more secure policy. There's no doubt about it. And even cookies. You can select to learn cookies, all 4 of our entity types. So now we're going to talk about staging. So that's learning. Learning builds a list of entities. So staging is a little bit different. Staging actually applies to attributes of an entity. Attributes. So for example, your name is Dan, but your attributes are dark hair, glasses, blue shirt. Those are attributes about Dan. So for example, I know I have a file type named ASP. That's the entity. But we also have some specific attributes about this file type. One of those attributes is a length requirement. And in this case, the length requirement is for the URL. And right now it's set to 100 bytes. So when ASM receives this request, where the URL is 31 bytes, ASM is going to see this as a legal request. No problem. if ASM were to receive this request, it's going to say that is too long, it's 116 bytes, that will be considered an illegal request. And I say illegal because I don't want to imply that it's going to be blocked. It may not be blocked, but it will be considered illegal per that attribute. Then we also have another length, the request length. That represents the entire HTTP request, like that we looked at yesterday. So as long as that request length is no more than 5,000 characters, it'll be considered legal. And this one is fine, well below 5,000 characters. Then we have the query string. The query string includes not just the URL, but any additional parameters and values. So this is again where we submit parameter names and values in the query string. And so that is set right now to a maximum of 1,000 characters. And that's only 71 bytes long, so that is no problem with that. Whereas this query string is 1,186 bytes long, and again, that will be considered illegal. Might get blocked, might not, but it will be considered illegal. And then finally, we have the post data length. So this is the information, if you're doing a true post, this is the information that goes in the body of a request, kind of like this. So this is what it would look like in the body. There's the parameter name, and then here's this crazy long value that they submitted. So the value is way too long because maybe they were trying to do something malicious. And so the post data length is 1,600 characters long, way too long, and that again would be considered illegal. So these are 4 different attributes about the ASP file type. And each file type can have its own attributes. So I've got 6 different file types. They all have slightly different length values. Now, is that necessary? No. Is it likely? Maybe. But it can be done. In a moment, we're going to look at attributes for parameters, and it makes a little bit more sense when you're looking at attributes for parameters versus file types. But the key here is every single entity can have its own unique attributes. So here is some of my file types with all of the attributes. And you'll see that some of them are different. That could have either been set manually, or that could have been done by ASM in automatic learning. So again, let's take a look at the same thing, same idea, but let's look at parameters instead of file types. So there's my list of parameters, and I'm only going to focus on one, the last name parameter, lname. So this parameter has also, this entity also has some attributes. The first attribute is the type of data, the data type. And this parameter has been set to alphanumeric, which means numbers and letters. So somebody tried to submit that last name with a hyphen in it. Right now, that last name will be seen as an illegal entry, possibly blocked. We have another attribute, the length value for that parameter. They've set a maximum length for the last name of 25 characters. And by the way, I did Google, that is the longest known last name, 35 characters long. So that right now would be seen as an illegal request because it violates the maximum length. Then we also have allowed characters, also known as allowed meta characters. This refers to every key on your keyboard. You can specify every key that people can type into a field. Now in this field, we've set the allowed characters to only A through Z. So that is also going to be considered illegal because of the 4 and the space, I believe. if somebody tried to submit that last name is going to be legal because it is alphanumeric, it's less than 25 characters, and it contains nothing but A through Z. So again, those are all attributes of the last name field. And just like file types, every parameter can have its own unique attributes. So it makes a lot more sense that the comment parameter's maximum length is going to be a lot higher than the last name parameter's maximum length. The comment's going to have a lot more allowed characters because people are typing in, sentences and such. So there's a lot more characters there. I have a zip code field parameter, and we've made that a data type integer with a maximum length of 5. We have a mobile phone that we actually have a data type of phone. So those are all the attributes about each one of those different entities. And all of that information comes during the staging process. So to get all of those attributes for file types, to get all of those attributes for parameters, each one of these entities will go through a staging process. So let's talk about how the staging process begins and then how it continues and when it ends. There's a beginning, a during, and an end to the staging process for every single entity, every file type, every parameter, every URL. All right, so from yesterday, we have our parameters. They're in the suggestion list. They have a learning score. The learning score is going to keep going up as time goes by. And then eventually, after several weeks, we're going to see that the learning score is going to hit 100%. So what happens at this point?
Accepted in staging.
Are we sure about that?
Oh, have we got automatic learning on?
I don't know. It doesn't say.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure.
It depends. What happens depends on if we're in automatic learning or manual learning. So if we're manual learning, the administrators now has to accept those. And remember, they could have accepted it when it was at 60% if they'd wanted. But if it's an automatic learning, they automatically get added to the policy. But we're going to assume that one way or another, they are now added to the policy. So they are now in the whitelist. In this case, the parameter whitelist. And now the staging process begins for those two parameters. It now begins.
So once they've been accepted, then they...
Correct.
Whatever the means of accepting was.
Correct. Once they're accepted into the policy, that begins the staging process. So what happens during the staging process? Well, we have to identify the attributes for these two parameters. We have to identify, should they have letters, numbers entered into them? Should the amount of characters be hundreds of characters or just a few characters? Now, we could do that ourselves manually, but why bother when ASM can do it for us? So what's going to happen is, the moment these are both added to the policy, accepted the policy, you can go look at the properties, the current properties for these two parameters, and this is what you're going to see. You're going to see that for both of them, the parameter type is ignore value, and that's the only thing you're going to see set for both of these. And what that basically means is ASM's not going to block anything or trigger anything negative for these parameters yet, because it doesn't know anything about them yet. And then a little time's going to go by, a week goes by, and then I can come back and I can look again at the two parameters, and I'll see, hey, some attributes have changed. So for my comment, the parameter value type is now set to user input value. The data type's been changed to alphanumeric, and the maximum length's been set to 50. Same for the last name field, except for the maximum length has only been set to 10. That's great, but 50 characters is not long enough for my comment field. So it's not done yet. It's still in the process. It's still in the staging process at this time.
But at this point, it's not blocking yet?
Correct.
Things that are outside of that?
Absolutely correct.
Boundaries.
So another couple weeks goes by, and we come take a look, and once again, the attributes have changed for both of these. For example, the maximum length for the comment field is now 500, it looks like there. In addition, we have our meta characters that are now being added to the allowed character list. And again, this is all done by ASM, not me. Why do you suppose ASM is suggesting that the space key and the hyphen and the parentheses and the dash, why do you suppose ASM is suggesting, or not even suggesting, why has ASM added those entries to the meta character list for the comment field? I'm sorry? Because people have been sending in requests for them. So all the staging is done based on requests that are coming in from either trusted sources or untrusted sources. And so when it sees, and it doesn't just take one request. So I can't have one user out there sending a comment with every keyboard character. It's not going to create a new attribute change from that. It requires a lot of entries, even more than learning. The staging process requires even more requests than learning to fine-tune these attributes. But once it's seen enough comments that have come in with the apostrophe, then it says, you know what? The apostrophe definitely needs to be a character for this field. And then there's also on the third tab of the parameter, we have the attack signatures. So attack signatures are at the parameter level. These are all, this list here, 618. That's 618 attack signatures that apply only to parameters. They're parameter level attributes, parameter level attack signatures. And what that means is now ASM's going to check for things like SQL injection attack signatures, cross-site scripting attack signatures, command execution, many different attack signatures. And it's decided that on its own during the staging process. So while we're in the staging process,
On the last slide, actually 2 slides ago, there was something there I didn't recognize. It said disallowed.
where are we at?
Next to the meta characters, on the line. Next slide, please. Disallowed. Is that significant?
You mean over here on the right?
Yeah, it has the hash code.
Oh, because by default, these meta characters are always disallowed for parameters, by default.
By default.
By default. So once we set a parameter, once a parameter gets set to alphanumeric, A through Z, 0 through 1, those characters are always by default allowed characters. But most of the other characters are disallowed until they end up in this list with this change to allow.
It's very confusing.
A little bit. I know. I understand where you're going at, that this shouldn't say disallowed. Just know that if it's, see this says overridden. So these are disallowed characters, but you're putting them in the overridden list because I want to override that default setting for these by making them allowed.
So default is allowed. Okay.
And by the way, one other thing. I can do all this manually if I wanted. I could go in and set the maximum length. I could go in and define all the characters. We can do it all manually if we want to. It's going to take a little bit more work. So while we're in this staging process, there's going to be some different milestones, some different points along the way that'll give us some indication about where we're at, how we're doing for a particular attribute. And I want to point out, I want to remind you, not for a particular attribute, for a particular entity. I want to remind you that all these parameters, they're all going through their own staging process. So one parameter might be completely done with its staging process. Another one might be only 20% along the way. And so we're going to see some indicators here. This first indicator where you have the little shield with the 3 lines, You can see up there it gives you a legend. That tells you that for those parameters, there are some learning suggestions available. So here's what this is referring to. So during the staging process, I'm going to try to make this not about ASM, okay? Let's say I was an art teacher and I've got a bunch of students and all the students are painting a picture, and so they've, most of them have drawn the head and the ears and so forth. And they're all at a point now where they're all just sort of like, what am I going to do next? What am I going to do next? So the teacher's just sort of looking around because the teacher wants to observe. And an hour has gone by and nobody's changed their drawing yet. So the teacher just wants some way of knowing, hey, somebody's now added a new piece to the picture. So building attributes for a parameter is similar. So a parameter might get to a point where it's alphanumeric, maximum length of 100 characters, and then it might stay that way for a while. That might be the picture of the parameter for a day or 3 days or a week, who knows? But then at some point, enough requests have come in that are longer than 100 characters, and maybe now the maximum length's been changed to 300 characters. So the picture of that parameter is changed. That's our indicator that, hey, something about that parameter, the attributes have changed. If we're in manual mode, I have to go accept those changes manually. If we're in automatic mode, the policy builder accepts those changes automatically. That's an important distinction. Manual mode, everything, every change to the policy, from entities that are learned to staging attributes, have to be done manually. So that's our indicator that, hey, there's some changes you might want to go look at, some updates, and see if you want to add them. We also, and so this process. So this staging process for a particular attribute, let's just go back to the comments attribute, the comment entity, the comment parameter. So I told you the staging process begins right when it's added to the policy. And then the staging process, how long does it take? Well, there's no answer to that question. So after a bunch of requests come in, ASM says, hey, I think this should be alphanumeric, maximum length 50 characters. Great, we got a picture. But then another 4 or 5 days goes by, and enough requests have come in, and ASM says, I don't think 50 characters is long enough. I think maybe it should be 300 characters. And now the picture's changed just a little bit. Now another 4 or 5 days goes by, and a bunch of more requests have now made ASM say, you know what, number one, I think this should actually be 500 characters long, and I think we should allow the carriage return, the comma, the exclamation point, a bunch of these characters. So once again, the picture's changed. And this process will just continue. Maybe several days have gone by now, and nothing's changed, except a lot of people have been entering in the semicolon. And enough entries with a semicolon have made ASM say, hey, let's add another new meta character. Let's add the semicolon. So for each one of those little sprints, I start here at this period of time, this default period of time that we always set at 7 days, and most people have no idea what this 7 days refers to. So they're like, okay, 7 days, sure, that's the default. Here's what this actually means. So now, staging process has begun. 7-day timer is starting. And now, ASM's looking at the comment field, and it says, hey, you know what, I think this should be alphanumeric. Boom, okay, let's change that, and comment goes back to the starting point of this enforcement readiness period. Now, a little bit of time goes by, 2 or 3 days, it says, hey, I think we should have a maximum length of 100 characters. Great, let's change that. We're going to reset this enforcement readiness period back to 0 again. Now a few days goes by, 2, 3 days, ASM says, hey, I think we should have 300 characters maximum, and the exclamation point and the comma. Great, let's add that. reset that parameter back to 0.
It's like a
Then
quarantine
a few days goes by, even let's say 4 days or 5 days have gone by, and ASM says, hey, I think we need to add the semicolon. Let's add the semicolon. Go all the way back. And now it's been 4 months of a lot of traffic coming through. This picture is getting more and more detailed, to the point where now there's not a whole lot of new changes. So now a day has gone by and ASM hasn't seen anything that comes in that's not already part of the comment picture. 2 days, nothing new. 3 days, nothing new. And it gets all the way to 7 days, and nothing has really changed about the picture of the comment field. What that means is ASM is going to say, hey, this particular parameter is now ready to be enforced. I don't see anything that's changed. I think the picture is perfect. I think you've got the right information that you need. And we'll see that indicator there with the little checkbox. But you're only going to see that indicator with the checkbox if you're in manual mode. Because in automatic mode, as soon as ASM identifies that a parameter is ready to be enforced, ASM enforces the parameter. It automatically enforces the parameter. This is a manual mode indicator that says, hey, you're in manual mode and that parameter is ready to be enforced. And at this point, it is up to an administrator to enforce it. Does that matter? Well, let's talk about that in just a couple more slides. But that's the end of the staging process for any particular entity, a file type, a URL, or a parameter. That's the end of the staging process, is when that entity is ready to be enforced and come out of staging. Hold that thought just for a second. Now, this is what the parameters will look like when they are enforced. So this is what it would look like in automatic mode for us one day. We'll open up our parameter list and say, hey, all these parameters are not in staging. I guess they've been enforced. ASM did it for us. How great. Or this is what it would look like in manual mode if I selected one of these and at the bottom is an enforce button and I can manually enforce it. And by the way, even in automatic mode, an administrator can manually enforce any entity at any time. They can do it, override ASM's automatic learning aspect. What's your question?
So in both of these modes, separately, manual and automatic, the learning suggestions available, what, if any, action is required when you see that?
Nothing for automatic mode. In manual mode, you have to go to the traffic learning page.
Okay.
And actually, that little icon, it's nice, is you can just click on that icon, takes you right to the traffic learning page, and it shows you all the suggestions for the mobile parameter.
So I have to do something in manual mode.
Absolutely.
From that state to ready to be enforced. If I go and accept, does that take it to ready?
No, because it's now that there have been changes that have been added, it's reset that enforcement readiness period again. But I want to point out, when you do go to the traffic learning page, you're going to see a variety of different suggestions. You might see a suggestion that says, hey, I'm suggesting you change this to alphanumeric. Hey, I suggest you change the maximum length to 200. Hey, I suggest you add a couple of meta characters, and so on. And you can accept or not accept all of those.
Does this process happen when learning is set to disabled?
No.
Staging process?
Disabled turns everything off when it comes to learning, staging, all of that.
No, it's okay.
Okay.
Answer the question.
Okay. Now, why does all this matter? I told you earlier, why does this matter? Whether it's enforced or not. What's the big deal about all that? Well, it does matter. And this slide is designed to explain why this is an important concept to understand. It is a very important concept. So we have two different modes for ASM, transparent and blocking. And we have entities that we've learned about. We have whitelists. I got my file type whitelist. my URL whitelist, my parameter whitelist. So we're going to touch on this one piece at a time. So we're just going to start with these whitelists. So for example, for my policy right now, that is my file type whitelist. That is my parameter whitelist. Somebody has just submitted a request for this URL. And of course, INI is not in my file type whitelist. So that is, at this point, considered an illegal request. Reminding you that illegal requests don't always get blocked. But it's illegal because it violates my file type. It's an illegal file type. Somebody also submits this request. So there's a parameter name called hack. Well, that parameter name's not in my parameter list. So same thing. This is a violation of the parameter list. So both of these are illegal requests. So my question to you is, while we're in transparent mode, will these two requests be allowed or will they be blocked? They're going to be allowed because nothing gets blocked in blocking mode. I'm sorry, nothing gets blocked in transparent mode. Always want to remember that. Nothing gets blocked. How about when we move to blocking mode, will these two requests be allowed or blocked? I'm sorry?
Blocked.
They will be blocked. These illegal requests will be blocked in blocking mode. This is kind of a review from yesterday. You should have seen that in your second exercise when you got blocked trying to access the readme.md file. Now, we're going to talk about attributes of a particular entity. So I have, as we say, I've got 4 different parameters that we're going to look at, and all 4 of these parameters are still in staging. So that column there says we have attributes that are not enforced, they are in staging. And here are all the current attributes of the comment field. It's a user input value, it's alphanumeric, maximum length 300 characters. We've got this allowed meta character list, and it's going to check for all of those 600 plus attack signatures at the parameter level. And somebody submits this comment in the comment field. Now, although that's not a malicious request, it is an illegal request. It's illegal because that meta character is not in this list. So we could actually think of this as a false positive. But it's currently an illegal request. Somebody else submits this comment. You should recognize that. That is a true malicious request. That's a cross-site script. And that should trigger a signature violation. So both of these are illegal requests. So the question is, do you suppose that these 2 requests with those 2 comments, are they going to be allowed or blocked when the policy is in transparent mode? Allowed, because again, nothing gets blocked in transparent mode. What about if we move the policy to blocking mode? You say allowed? Anybody disagree? You're correct. They're going to be allowed. And this is the key to understanding this whole idea of enforcement, is even though I'm in blocking mode, and even though I have a nice list of parameters, they're not violating my parameter list. They have a parameter called comment. We have a parameter called comment. So they're not violating that. What they're violating are attributes about the parameter. And while an entity like a comment field is still in staging, that means it's not enforced. And think about what that means. It's not enforced. Which means people could submit SQL injection attacks against that comment field all day long, and they'll never get blocked. Now, we have enforced all of our parameters. They're no longer in staging. So these two comments in transparent mode, do you suppose these will be allowed or blocked? I hope this is becoming repetitive. Nothing gets blocked in transparent mode. What about if we move the policy to blocking mode? Will these get allowed or blocked? This is where they will get blocked. And that summarization table, is an important one to understand. And I'll tell you why. It's very possible that you're going to have a list of file types and a list of parameters where some are in staging and some are enforced. And I could have a complete policy because we didn't quite understand what we were doing. So I got a nice list of parameters. I don't have any new parameters, so I've disabled learning. We're all ready to go. And I continually get notifications from my security team at my company that we're getting hit with SQL injection attacks constantly against, we'll say, the password field, trying to pick one that's, or this queue field. And the reason is, when, in this case a parameter, when any entity is still in staging, ASM, even in blocking mode, ASM will not block malicious, illegal requests that violate any aspects of its attributes. And for parameters, that includes signature violations. So many a company have found that the reason they were still getting attacked is their parameters never got enforced. And it was a simple final step of just enforcing the parameters. Because again, we can do that manually if we want to. We could just select those remaining parameters, and at the bottom of this page we have an enforce button. Boom, we're done, and now we're secured. It's almost like training a guard out in front of your house, but then never giving them the real gun. Always leaving them with the fake gun when they were going through their training process. Now yesterday we also saw on our signatures that signatures are also in staging. And the idea there is so that we can isolate any false positives, any signature-based false positives. So if we're going to immediately apply 3,300 signatures, we may not want to just, boom, start blocking everything against those signatures, because there could be a lot of false positives. So the idea is we go through a staging process and we identify requests that are triggering signatures. And then we can begin to enforce them as we see fit. As soon as we see requests that are triggering a signature, and we can go, hey, that's malicious. I can pick and choose. I can select a signature, and again at the bottom we have an enforce button, and I can begin to enforce my signatures. We have ways, we have nice tools inside of ASM to let us see which signatures are triggering violations. And we can just pull up that list and enforce them all at one time. One of my demos walks through that. I have a demo for attack signatures, and you do just that in that demo. You trigger some signatures, and then you enforce them immediately upon that. But again, important to note that if all of your signatures remain in staging for the lifetime of your security policy, ASM will never block a request of any type, not just a parameter-based attack, but a signature that triggers any part of the request, anywhere within the HTTP header. It'll never block one of those requests. So we can, if we're ready to, we can enforce all of our signatures either on this page, but this takes a while because unfortunately you can only enforce what you can see on the page. So you got 3,300 signatures, you've got to go to the next page and the next page. Another way you can do this real easily, there's all my signatures. You know, some of them are enforced now, some are not. But I can also Make sure you guys understand that. We can also come to our Learning and Blocking Settings page and open up our Attack Signatures section. And in this section here, in addition to seeing all the signature sets that are available, we have one checkbox option so that if you want, you can clear that, apply your policy, and now all signatures are enforced automatically.
One slide before this. So it's about the signature. I do see the alarm options there. So I would assume that if there's certain traffic that hits this signature, it will be alarmed.
What happens is you'll get information in the alert log, in the log. So for example, if let's say you're logging to a syslog server, you're going to get all that information. You'll have all the visibility you want in your external log server because you're going to see every time a signature was violated, but it wasn't blocked. That's what the alarm does. And that's what you need. If you are going to slowly enforce your signatures, you need to see which signatures are getting hit. Because not every signature attack is a successful one. Because the bottom line is this, maybe we'll summarize with this. Yesterday we talked about SQL injection and do we want to put all the work of checking requests on my web server or my application server and so forth. And I said, wouldn't we rather put that work on the ASM and have it do the protection? And I still say yes. But the truth is, for a lot of basic, like SQL injection attacks that you guys did yesterday, those are not going to succeed on Amazon. Amazon does have updated, database server code, updated updates, security updates, and so forth. So it's probably going to withstand stuff. Again, I still say I'd rather not have the request make it to the SQL server to find out that it's strong enough. But so I can have signatures that make it through, get an alert about it, knowing that the signature is probably not going to succeed. It's probably not going to succeed in its task. But as soon as I see it's going through, then maybe I can enforce it. And now it'll no longer make it through anymore. So, there's different processes different organizations use. I could not tell you what every organization does. I will tell you that a couple years ago I had somebody from Japan who told me that when he joined, he took over an account from another SE who had left F5, and his customer, they had had their security and policy in place for a year. They had put all this work into it, and they were continuing to get attacked because that checkbox was still checked. All their signatures were still in staging, and all they had to do was deselect that and save it, and their problem was solved. One simple checkbox. So I want you to think now, make sure you understand this idea about staging. That's really the key here. Staging and enforcement. Staging is when we're building a picture. Enforcement is when we know the picture is complete.
I think your most significant slide in terms of understanding the concept was the 3 states and underscoring that staging is a second process. I think there's a lot of people that feel that learning, now I'm done, now I'm going to mark these as staged, but I don't think there's a lot of universal understanding.
There's not.
And staging is a process that needs to happen. You can short circuit it, but...
I agree 100%. When I learned ASM, I was actually taught staging completely wrong. So it took me like another year just of playing with the product to really start to understand a little bit more. And you're absolutely right. This is the kind of thing that scares people because they don't understand it, which is why I will stop at nothing to try to get you guys to understand it better. And if you go back and look at those demos, you'll see that I have at least 3 or 4 or 5 that really walk through what this staging means, what it means to stabilize a policy and so forth. And so after class, you can even go farther and explore more with this concept. Now this last exercise, you'll get a chance to really see this in action. For this exercise to work, I talked about this yesterday, we're going to do something that you would never do in production. We are going to drastically shorten the staging process timeline so that ASM can build this picture a lot faster. You would really never want to do that in the real world. But we're going to do it for the purposes, because what I want you to see in this exercise is I want you to see the staging process taking place automatically. I want you to see ASM building the picture of some of our parameters, and then changing the picture of those parameters, and then eventually enforcing the parameter on its own, taking it out of staging just from the traffic that you're generating. And of course, you're going to use another macro. Just make sure that every time you run the macro, it's in a private window. That is a requirement for this to work. And then the last thing you will do is I will hope you will see how we can violate an attribute. You're going to violate a length for a URL, a query string. You're going to violate a query string length, an attribute of one of the file types. And then you're going to violate a parameter, some of the attributes about a parameter, and see if you get blocked or not blocked. That's, again, the whole key. Do I get blocked or do I not get blocked?